Dr. Ezinne Ezepue. I'm a lecturer of film at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. I teach both undergraduate and graduate studies. I teach documentary in the graduate level and film studies in the undergraduate level. But my research interest has always been the Nigerian film industry, essentially. And since my PhD days, where I interrogated the transformations that were reshaping the Nigerian industry, I've always been very keen about evolving film economies, both in Nigeria and across Africa. And so beyond our story, I also saw the potential in African stories to begin to transform how Africa is viewed among Africans, especially how much hope we have and how stories can help shape the visions we have about Africa, and how we can begin to transport stories that will help change people's perception and perspectives about Africa. So that bettered my postdoc in African storytelling, and that's essentially what I'm doing. I'll talk about that later. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Valerie Lopes. People call me Val. I'm of Cape Verdean origin, but born in Europe. And so I worked in sound for a long time. I'm an audio engineer. I worked in sound for like the first 10 years of my life, basically. Then I decided to expand my work activities more into technology as my day-to-day work. I'm a tech consultant in design and technology in general. And besides that, I produce films and I do storytelling around the African stories. So I look for something that I consider interesting, and I try to find an original way to tell it by not always respecting the Western approach to storytelling and filmmaking, but by rather letting it flow and letting it develop in a more modern way that would be consistent to what our ancestors would have done under the baobab tree when they tell a story at night. So it's all about connecting now with the ancient ways of our own people. That's what I do basically. And my Cape Verdean origin also make that I have a strong music background, and I work on my own music in my projects. That's it in a nutshell.
Talk to us a little bit more about your Cape Verdean connections. You weren't born there?
I was not born there.
Okay,
I always say I was born, I immigrated before being born, actually. So I was born in Luxembourg, in Europe. There's a strong Cape Verdean community in Luxembourg since like probably end of the 60s. More or less, they started immigrating there with the Portuguese at a time where Cape Verde was still a Portuguese colony. And that's the time when my parents immigrated there. And yeah, that's basically the connection that I have to Luxembourg. And because of that, of course, I have also a strong connection to Portugal, my former colonizer, that you know how that influences us always. And that's always where, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know if it's unfortunately, we tend to rotate around that Lusophone world, or around that Anglophone world, or around that Francophone world as Africans. And I try to break that. That's why I try to, now I'm living in Tanzania, more in the Anglophone world, more in the, and I really try to break that preconception.
So what was the link? Was it just your parents and the Cape Verdean community in Luxembourg that birthed that sort of energized, continued to hold your interest or your connectivity? Or did you go back with your parents, visited and all of those? I mean, while growing up, did you visit and all of that? Yes. Or was it just that community in Luxembourg?
I actually did visit, and I always had a strong connection to Cape Verde, although I was also, of course, connected strongly to where I was born, Luxembourg. But I guess if you're talking about link, I think about that, the strongest link probably is the skin color. No matter where you go, you can't leave your roots behind. While if I'm Italian and I immigrate to the United States, I'm easily mixed up and I easily lose my connection. But when you're physically different, or like in terms of color, then skin color, then you're always reminded, and you always remind yourself even of where you basically come from. And that's the thing that I noticed that is less strong here on the continent, the fact that you see yourself as a different color because everybody around you is just the same color. But when you are like, when I look at my old school, primary school pictures, and I see that I'm the only one, or sometimes one out of two kids that are darker, and the other ones are all very light skinned, and you're constantly reminded, oh yeah, actually that's how it was. And I guess that's the strongest link, actually. That's what attracted me back. Some people then develop some kind of disconnection because they want to forget about that layer that is very obvious, and other people, they build a connection. I guess I was more of that curious group of people that try to build a connection and find out where they come from.
Let's build a little bit more on this identity, the skin color identity thing, because I lived almost all my life in Nigeria. I was born in Nigeria. I grew up in Nigeria, studied my first degree in Nigeria, and didn't step out of Nigeria until my MA days, and then my PhD, which I had in the UK. And I remember that sort of disconnection, also the realization that you are one among so many and you are so different, and also coming to realize, especially in the UK, when something happens and everyone, especially amongst the Black people, and then everyone says, oh yeah, and it's something wrong, and then someone says, oh, it has to be in Nigeria. And it's almost like there is a profile, that there is profiling that is already going on, profiling amongst the Black people, profiling for Nigerians and Ghanaians and all of those, and then profiling amongst the larger racial groups, Blacks and whites and all that. So what was it like for you? Was there any sort of childhood stories that drew you back to say, in the future, I want to unseat? Because for me, I felt stereotyped, and it was part of the things that drove me into my research about trying to unseat stereotype, to change the narrative. Did you have such experiences growing up? And I just want to connect that to what you did with your story, with the film, with your documentary, Africologist. Just tell us a little bit about your personal experiences and how that led you to what you're doing today.
I think there's a first of all, what you went through with Nigeria, I experienced that very often about and Nigerians. Unfortunately, I guess people develop some kind of like stories that then trend, and that's good for good stories, but bad for bad stories, because then
definitely.
Yeah, that's typical human thing. Like, oh, those people, once you mark them, it's difficult to get rid of that, and that happens a lot. And I guess it's trending strongly with Nigerians, but fortunately there are so many Nigerians that are proving all the contrary, and it's it's wonderful, actually. And so the thing about Luxembourg is, what I noticed also is former colonies, former colonizers, let's say it that way, like Portugal, Britain, France, they have strong stereotypes. They are the ones that keep imposing those stereotypes that have been circulating for hundreds of years, because they needed an excuse to oppress us. So they developed all those stories and those ideas and those stereotypes around us. But I noticed that in Luxembourg, it was more a matter of fear, a matter of, I don't know those people, so let me behave with them differently. Let me pay a little bit attention. Let me be more careful. Let me say it that way. Of course, there was a little bit of stereotype that came over, that lived there also, because no country in Europe was innocent, certainly not Luxembourg also, which was also sending some people to some colonies, but it was not a colonizing state, let's say it that way. So I couldn't even call it racism, what I experienced there, because if I look at the 2-3 cases of racism that I had until like my 18, 19-year-old, when I started traveling, those cases of racism were so rare that I would say that's the exception that confirms the fact that Luxembourg in itself is not racist. And then now the fact that I think 48% of the population, they are foreigners, and a huge amount of people are of African descent also. It proves also that racism is not really there in the way that as we know it. Then the racism there that I did experience when I look back was very often Portuguese, was very often young Portuguese kids whose parents were part of this colonizing system. Cape Verde became independent in the mid-70s, and all those Portuguese colonies. Until that time, there was this huge war between Portugal and all those colonies, and many of those people, many Portuguese were in Luxembourg, also people who fled the war, people who decided, no, I'm going to leave Portugal because I don't want to be drafted into that war. So those people, that's the ones that had some kind of racist connotation towards me. And again, I'm not calling all Portuguese racist, but that's where the majority of that antagonism against my skin color was coming. So I guess that's the situation that you have also around the world, is the fact that it's what Mandela said, you're not born racist, you develop it. So Luxembourg didn't have to develop racism, so there was not real racism around there. Just like my uncle, who is considered the first Luxembourgish Cape Verdean who arrived in Luxembourg, he used to say that when he would walk down the street in the 60s, people would cross on the other side and then look from afar, look at him from afar, which is more like a fear, or like what is going on there, what happened to his skin or whatever. But that was not really like a go home or whatever.
Yeah.
That's the kind of things that I would hear from Portuguese kids, like negro or go home or that kind of things. Luxembourgish people would never tell me that. Luxembourgish people was more the kind of situation where you're sitting somewhere, there's another Cape Verdean there too, then this Cape Verdean leaves, then they start saying, oh, he did this and that, but you know, you're different. No, but then you know, oh, actually I'm not, because you just said that when he left. So what do you say when I leave? You understand what I mean? Like little connotations that are not really like go home or whatever, but really like more like I'm careful with you. That's what happened there a lot.
Yeah. Okay. So that's, because the idea is about this stereotyping, this defining of a person based on what stories we've heard or what ideas we already have built on. How did that inspire the story? Or just tell us the story of Africologist. What led to Africologist?
What led to Africologist is, before this, I worked on Amilcar Cabral. I made a documentary on Amilcar Cabral, which was a freedom fighter from Cape Verde, like our Mandela, let's say it that way, or our Nyerere, or our whatever, Sankara, who was assassinated by the Portuguese in '73. And I remember those vinyl covers that my father had. Like, we were not allowed to have guns, like toy guns even. We did have some, but was not really seen as something wonderful or something that you should have. But then on those disc covers, you would see Cabral with his gun there fighting the Portuguese, and he would play this music every Sunday. And there was a fascinating thing about Cabral also, the way he rebelled against the Portuguese, the revolutions he started, and the wars he started. He basically participated in all the Portuguese independences, and even from some other countries he helped. So I worked on a project, because when I would talk about him to scholars and academics of European origin or more Eurocentric, they would always say, oh, he copied Karl Marx in his writings, or he copied this one or that one, and he's a Marxist, or he is whatever they would come up with to like say, oh, he's not that fabulous. So I decided to call him Cabralist, because it's a term that didn't exist before, but that I think when you write the number of books that he wrote, if Marx deserves to be called Marxist with all his ideologies, Cabral certainly deserves to be called Cabralist. And it worked. I made a film called Cabralist. I released it without promoting the word too much. And the word is used now pretty interestingly. And I thought, let me start a marketing campaign around that term and everything, which is basically what I did with Cabralista, with that first documentary in the Cape Verdean Circle. So now I was thinking after that, what can I do on a more continental scale? for Africa. And then I found this term that was coined by Molefe Asante, an African-American scholar who coined this term Africologist. And I thought, okay, that makes a lot of sense, Africologist, because you have Egyptology, which is in Africa. You have mathematics that was born in Africa. You have so many sciences that originated in Africa. You have a continent where history even started, because history starts with humans. Where do humans come from? It's Africa. So the oldest story of humanity has to be African. There's no other way. So the word, the term Africologist, I thought, deserves that somebody starts a marketing campaign around it. And I thank Molefe Asante for starting that term. And let's bring it out of the academic circle. Let's try to make it something that people will say, oh, I'm an Africologist. I'm researching my origins. I'm not researching where I come from. I'm trying to understand where I come from. And I think that's very important, that we have our own terms, our own way to defend ourselves, that we stop defending ourselves in westernized terms or in a westernized ways, but that we also accept our ways of doing this kind of things. And I don't think I could make a PhD. I thought of that a lot of times, even after Cabralista. I was even proposed to make one around the Amilcar Cabral and that idea of Cabralista, but the academic circle is not for me. I'm too rebellious for that. So I thought the best thing I can do is make a film and then see what happens with that term.
So your definition of Africologist is an African digging into or trying to understand his origins.
Yes, I think that scholar that you see in the film, that 3D character, that young girl, I think we are in a time where we need to promote also the woman scholar, so the woman mind behind everything, and try to find a balance. That's why I included that character. But I think she's searching. She's searching what is an Africologist. She's using that term because it's a wonderful term. I think it's beautiful. When I say I'm an Africologist, I try to be one, and when I use it, I feel empowered when I use that term. And people get curious about it when you say, "Oh, Africologist," and it sticks. So I guess that's the power behind it. But I don't want to define it. I just wanted to lead it a little bit in one direction. If somebody wants to do something that takes it in another direction, feel free to do it. But there is an Africology. It's something that should exist. It's something that certainly doesn't exist. But a idea, a concept, or anything will only enter a dictionary or an encyclopedia when there's a term to put next to what that description is. So we are all described by now. You, me, everybody who's researching Africa, or who's trying to understand our origins, or trying to uncover what was covered by the so-called discoveries of these westernized, because they would come and say they discover here. But by that, in that process was just the process of covering what we had. So we are uncovering now again. And that in that process of uncovering, I think we are doing that work, but nobody will put it in an encyclopedia unless there's a word to put next to it. Maybe it's not Africologist, or maybe somebody will find a better term for that, but we have to think about that, and we have to work on that, on defining it. And this work of defining it started in probably the 50s, 60s in the United States, even before it started. And there was, even into the 80s, there was a very strong movement of trying to define these things and to define a science or a study that could fit into this. And I think we normal people who are not academics should do that also. We should bring it mainstream and see what we can do around that.
Great. I like very much that you are living it, or you are introducing Africologist as a neologism. So everybody, in whatever field you are, the scholar, practitioner, whatever, can take ownership of it and define it from your own field or from your own understanding and all that. So now would be the best time or the good time to talk about the film. So talk to us about Africologist, the documentary.
It's actually, I tried to include as much as I can of like explaining the world from an African point of view. So this world is very philosophical. This world is very depending on a culture, something is good or bad. So what is the African point of view of everything? What is the African point of view that also includes science? Some have a kind of a phobia on science here on this continent especially. So how can we marry traditions and science and tell a story that includes more or less everything, or like that gives like a very short resume. In 1 hour you can't do much, but it's divided in 8 chapters. It starts with the origins of the universe. So it shows a little bit of the Big Bang, which is also, again, in science, even in science now, is a contested idea, but which starts with the origins of the universe, the expansion of the universe, which nobody will question, even if you might question the origin moment itself. You want to question the expansion of it and how the elements came together and all that, and it compares that with some African mythology. And then this idea is continued further with the origins of life. So it shows a little bit of the origins of life, and it uses another African story to like compare biology and everything with African stories. Then after the origins of life, it shows what I like to call the golden ages of Africa, the times of Mansa Musa, maybe it's the best way to say it, where Africa was simply the best continent to live on Earth, probably the best continent to live on, although that's also questionable, but that where Africa was really in the front of everything. And then it talks about the dark ages of Africa, which is basically where the dark ages of Europe start to end, because they maybe it's ugly to say that, but they came here to find their light, and so Africa got into their own dark ages. And then it continues with the independence movements. When we got our independences, it goes into Anthropocene, which is this time that we are living in, where we are basically destroying this planet and climate change and all that. Then it talks about technology a little bit. That chapter is called Technosphere. And it ends in the future of humanity, and what is Africa's place in that. That's basically, in a nutshell, the structure of the film and what happens in the film. So it starts with the origins of the universe, and it basically ends with a African station on Mars, an African colony on Mars. That's how the film ends. Because if humanity is expanding to other places, what is Africa's place in that? What are we gonna do to continue and to prosper in the future? Are we going in the back of that spaceship as a group of slaves, or are we going as captains of those ships? And so I even argue about some points there, how we might even end up, or what the danger is of ending up as slaves in the back of that ship, because of our melanin, because of other reasons. So that's basically what the film is about. It shows those 8 chapters. It shows how, for example, even smartphones originated here, how not smartphone itself, but the concept of binary code and all that originated in Africa, and it shows some mathematics of Africa and things like that in a very, very visual and true examples. So it's a little bit easier to understand that way than having to read some academic papers, because everything in the film is academically backed.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, this is a PhD. All you need to do is just defend it, and then you have your PhD.
Yes,
like,
exactly.
It's
yeah.
exactly a PhD. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, it's easier for contemporary people to simply see it on screen rather than have to read it on text. It's really amazing. It's fantastic work, and I have so many questions popping up in my head. Now, recently I was in a conference, and there is this fantastic young man who was given a paper on gaming and development of games in Zimbabwe. And he was talking generally about Africa. He said something about knowledge starting or developing from Africa. And then it was this room full of West Europeans, but mostly, I don't know about if they were all Germans, but it was here in Germany, and someone snickered among the audience. And I was, instead of it hit me that they sneak in. I wanted to understand why they sneak in, why did someone sneak her? But obviously, when I reflected on it, I thought about that. If knowledge actually started with Africa, and this was one of the things that your documentary talked about, and then we lost it, why is it so difficult for us now to get back? It's almost like we lost our foothold, and we are yet to find a place to place our feet and then regain and catch up, not even overtake. We are not yet catching up. What is it? Did you find anything in your research, in the course of your research, that gives an answer to why we have been overtaken and we can't catch up?
I think if a group of Martians would come, not Martians, some aliens would come to Earth now and show us how they add or multiply 1,345 by 6,895,000, for example, we would look at it and we would say, what stupid method is that? Then we would look at it again. Yeah, now I get it. And then, it's actually interesting and it works. And that's exactly the point, is that knowledge, there's not just one knowledge. The result is always the same, which is truth in knowledge, or seeking truth. But the way to get there is different. And the world that we live in is constructed and built, everything in it is built around that European way of getting to that truth. So if we want to explain our truth, we have to defend it first. They might start noticing after some time that with our truth, you get to the same result, but it will take a longer time for them to understand the process, or for them to say that our process is valid too. And that's exactly what I try to show in the film also, is not that there is a European knowledge and an African knowledge, and the African knowledge is better, or there is also a Chinese knowledge or other cultures in the world that had their way of doing things. There is no better way. There is no better way, as long as you get to that fundamental truth. It's just how are you defending it and how are you getting to that truth. That's the point. So when you go and you say, oh, Africa had this and that knowledge, the only thing that will differentiate the African knowledge or the African way from the European way is probably the fact that it can only be the first one, or that it started here and that theirs came later. But that doesn't mean that ours is better. So the first thing we have to do is to realize that none is better. And Europeans have to do that too. They have to realize also that no knowledge is better. No way of doing things is better. One might be more efficient when you're using binary computers with electricity and all that. You have very fast systems where you don't care about how many steps are in the process, because computers are so fast that you don't count the steps. But then when you see how humans work, they need a way of doing it that has less steps. You take a piece of paper and it reduces the number of steps that you have to take to get to a result. And humans are slower, so you want less steps. That's how it works. But the two methods, binary ways of multiplying, or our tables that we learn to create in school, the two methods work, but one is made for computers, the other one is made for humans, and the one from the aliens is made for aliens, the one for Africans is made for Africans. That's how the world is. So it's just respect the other one. That's what we have to do. Even I think we as Africans, we have to respect the fact that Europeans managed to make their way of doing things be the dominant one. Yeah. But they have to also accept that they destroyed ours in the process. They have to acknowledge that they destroyed us in the process to some extent. And all these things are very important, but I don't think there is a better way. And that's probably one of the first things that we should realize, that there is no other way, no better way, and that we should respect always and all people and how their cultures get to things. And I think principally in this age where climate change is destroying us all, the African ways were probably the most sustainable ones. The African knowledge is the most sustainable ones. The African approach is the most sustainable one. So it's in their own interest to respect it, then to look at it, and then to understand it, and maybe take some of it and use it for themselves. That's, I think, very important in this age, that we go back to ancient ways of doing things, not by putting technology aside, but by marrying with technology or with this Western way of technology. And then maybe we can save this planet in the process. And that's what I try to pass in that film.
Great. So what I hear you saying is we cannot survive in isolation, and I still hear this voice or this re-echoing of the need to decolonize our curriculum. I don't know if you've heard about that, but there's consistent call for decolonization. Now I'll ask you, as an Africologist, what would you think will be the relevance of decolonization of curriculum to the development of Africa, or to the re-energization of our educational growth to get back to where we used to be? How relevant would it be?
I tried to do that. I tried to work also on a little bit more practical side around the film. So I had in Rwanda before COVID, when I was still working on the film, I had an incubator where I was working with a group of young engineers, volunteering, and I developed this curriculum that I call Applied Africology, that I was working with the students on, where we took ancient ways of doing things here and some games and other things, and try to develop products and include that into technology and try to lead it into a more modern way. That was the first step. Then last year with the university in Angola, I had, during one semester, I had a course around applied Africology that I have the curriculum of that also, that I developed, that I was teaching to the students. It's nothing that competes with what they already learned, but it's more of a material that is added to their normal curriculum, where they were learning about certain things that you see in the film. They were learning them more deeply, and they were learning like the science behind and the right terms to express it. And I made it very digestible also. And it's just something that you take with you when you leave school or when you go into the working world, where you can always have a second thought, that where you say, okay, how does this relate to my culture? How does this link to my culture? Because I think, for example, what I'm enabled China to develop is the fact that their culture is included in their technology. If I take WeChat, if I take any product that had success in China, it's very culturally Chinese. So by doing that, no foreigner can come and compete with something that you created for your people, that is so culturally connected to them that it can just work and people from outside cannot imitate it. While here, what is happening with technology very often, of course, there are cases like M-Pesa, which is culturally very connected to Africa, and which would be very difficult for foreigners to come and replicate, although it's not 100% African M-Pesa, but it's culturally, it's a technology that was developed here, if I could say it that way. And if we replicate that kind of way of working, maybe we could develop our continent in a way where we can compete with others and they can't colonize our systems. They can't come and say, okay, this is now the best way of doing things. Maybe Uber, I haven't seen yet a country in Africa, maybe South Africa, some places, Uber is working very well, but they had to adapt a little bit to the local markets and change their products a little bit to work better here. And I have yet to see where is a huge African app that can say, okay, I can compete with all those ride-sharing apps, because culturally our people understand this better than the other one. And if we can include our culture in those things, that's how we can differentiate our products. Products have their differentiation very often is culture. And I think that's what I tried to include in that course, besides other things also. And that's why also I worked on this applied Africology. How do you take all this academic side and apply it to real life? And I'm still working on that. And the goal really is to take this further. So the film is the first step. The film is just a way to defend it in mainstream, and then see what else can be done afterwards. And I hope other people also will consider to have a plan with the way that we think, and not just like post videos on YouTube or whatever. Oh, people in Egypt were black. No, develop something around that. Use that in a good way. That's what we need to do.
I see, and I hear the academic in you speaking, and I'm wondering why you aren't there. And beyond, you said Kenya. Beyond Kenya, do you have in mind to take propose this program to other universities? Was it undergraduate or graduate level?
Of course, I will take it to other places. This was just they were teaching it to students besides their normal curriculum, young engineers also, again, in electronics. And of course, I want to take this further, but I'm very careful, and I rather work slowly. I rather work quietly without attracting too much attention until something is shaped in the way that it has to be. Because, and that's the same with the film. Like, I made also sure in the film that everything is academically backed, that there is even, sorry for the way I'm saying it, there's even, let me say it in very layman's and kind of stupid terms, everything in the film is backed by white people. I'm sorry. There's many sciences and things that happen here that are not accepted yet by the whites, but if we start with those that are accepted by them, and then in the second one, I work on those that are not accepted by them, then by that time, it will be much easier for me to reach them and to defend the work than if I go straight away into like discrediting everything that other people say. So there's a lot missing also in the film, which is normal also in such a short time, but you have to have a strategy. You can't like try to change the world in one day. Go slowly, work slowly, and I think it can work. But I really believe we need this kind of approaches to things. We need to work closer between filmmakers and academics. There needs to be a very close work. And because film very often defines film very often defines the science that comes afterwards. The first phones, or the guy who invented the smartphone first saw the tricorder, or what it is called in Star Trek, and thought, hey, we need something like that. We need to be able to communicate mobilely. And Jules Verne inspired moon landings and other things. So we need that here too. We need that here too. People like you who are more in the academic field need also people to make stories that where you might be curious, that thing, I need to explore it. And then maybe you write another paper on whatever they show in their films.
Yeah. And then we were wowed at the level of research, the amount of research that went into this documentary. And we're wondering, how did you do it? How did you decide what goes in, where you're going to get this data, what to chase and what not to chase? Because I know this was voluminous, it was a lot.
The script would have led to a 3-4 hour documentary. And by talking about it, by presenting it in different places, by discussing it with friends, by working on different video ideas, I slowly started narrowing down to what stories make more sense, what science makes more sense. But there's things that are 10 times deeper than what you see in the film that I had to get out because you can't explain them in an hour, or because it's impossible even to talk about them in that way. There's things here in this continent where I ask myself, why are we not diving into this? There's things that are really deeply scientific, where there are really things with huge question marks that could really, like, even if they turn out, even if you research it and it turns out to prove itself wrong, it's so there's so much value in proving that even then you should still do it. There's so much here. There's so much here that is covered still. There's so much, like, Disney built itself on European fables and European Snow White and all those stories that are 1,000, 2,000 years old. Africa has a pool of those that could lead to another Disney, that could lead to another $1 trillion company in entertainment or in science also. There's so much to uncover here, so many things that are not explored. Like, take something like the fact that most coffee in the world either Arabica or Robusta, and then you go to Ethiopia where coffee comes from. And genetically, if you look at the genes of coffee, you have hundreds of species of coffee. And that's just a very simple way of showing how much is here. And that's in so many fields, so many things. I try to be very, I explore a lot. I spend a lot of time reading articles around science. I try to read some papers. Sometimes it's a little bit too deep, but my curiosity won't stop me. So I try to explore those things. And there's so much here. And I think if you have a cross-disciplinary mind, if you have a mind where you say, okay, let me try to understand a little bit of this and a little bit of that, things start crossing. And everything that is developed in the last 20 years, or most of it in science and discoveries and technologies, cross-disciplinary science, is because you combine different things. There's no big discoveries, or not many big discoveries to be done by now. Like all materials now are mixes of materials, are not just simple elements that you're using. You're not discovering a new iron, you are making a new material that combines different elements or whatever. So that's where the future lies. And there's so many combinations to discover in Africa, let's say it that way. And I think it's just incredible. It's just incredible. And I wish people would do that more. There's room for hundreds of Africologist things. Or films or whatever. There's so much to discover.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I'm looking at time, and we should be rounding up very soon. But I know for people who are going to be seeing or who have seen Africologist, I'm sure they'll be wondering, considering where you went to, how much time it took, and all that. How long did it take you to get the scripts ready, the materials ready to write the scripts, and obviously because it was scripted, and obviously how long did it take you to make this documentary?
I don't know if I can say exactly how long, but probably 4 or 5 years. But then there's a lot of that was already prepared before, because it's just I just collect ideas and things and then I just put them together. But and so I made also all the 3D myself. I made the music myself. So of course that takes time too, but not 100% of my time in these last few years, because of course I have to do other things. I have to live and everything besides that, but probably 4 or 5 years of work, and then intensively during COVID. Thank you, COVID. Thank you for that. Sometimes we have to say thank you, COVID. And yeah, that was more or less what happened with the film. And then I finished it. Beginning of this year, I really focused on it and I finished it up.
So how long did you shoot?
The shooting also is there's things that might have been shot like 4 years ago. There's things that were shot in January. So it's really like dispersed also. And so there's also reconstructions in 3D, which takes longer than the shoot. The shooting is very simple for me. The shooting is not complicated because it's a scripted film. So I was just adding images to that. There's not really, there was not too many complications in it.
And what did it cost you?
The cost also is something one day I should sit and calculate, but
you haven't calculated.
Yes, yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, and then I guess finally, talking about the future. Okay, how do you think storytelling can help us reshape the African help African society re-evolve in a way? Because this Young Africologist is one way to enlighten us on where we were, what we used to be, where we are, where we could be. How do you think storytelling as a tool can help us further evolve, get to that place of the future that every one of us wants to be, and see that vision of Africa that we all have in our head? Africa the Great, Africa this, and all of that.
I think, did you watch The Woman King?
I haven't, unfortunately. We're planning to see this week.
If I had a way to express my feelings after watching it, and I watched it twice, so that feeling is what storytelling can do. And many people had it with Black Panther. Other people had it with other examples. I think that's what storytelling can do. That's the look. Carl Sagan was a great scientist and documentary filmmaker in the 70s. Unfortunately, he died relatively young. One of the first people who made us understand that climate change is something that exists, that it's important. He managed to get NASA to include his research into when they send the sonde to Venus, and they noticed also on Venus that there is some kind of heat trapped there because of the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. The heat is trapped in the atmosphere there, and that's why Venus is the hottest planet. And that scientists came out in the US in the 70s, where people had reached a certain level of education and comfort, that was born after the Second World War, and reached a certain age where people were interested in things, and people had disposable time to say, okay, now let me watch something educational. Let me be more curious. Now I have time to relax and watch TV and be more curious. Africa, we are in that time now. When I look at friends all across the continent, the middle class Africans that are a little bit now in a more comfort situation, and also the fact that technology is giving access to everybody to have some data and watch something sometimes. I think if we can include more knowledge and wisdom and intelligence into the content that is consumed on this continent, because content is consumed, it's hugely consumed, then we could really change things here. A 10-year-old kid needs not see Jay-Z or Wizkid. Of course, they need that too. You need the dance, you need the fun and all of that. But what about a black astronaut? What about a black doctor woman somewhere in the world doing heroic things that will inspire that one to become a doctor too? That kind of things. It's those little things, those little stories that are important. The positive side needs to go out, and our people need to create that positive side. And a lot of positivity is actually not true. Like the whole image around the United States and this huge country that saved the world and everything, and got us out of the Second World War and gave us chewing gum and everything, and Coca-Cola and everything. That's a very, I don't want to say untrue story, but it's a story that has a lot of propaganda, and that helped them get to the moon and build everything that came afterwards. So it's that positive story that we need to promote. And here in Africa, we need to get that positiveness out. We need more patriotism, which is difficult to get when countries are actually a product of post-colonialism, and tribes, which is something that exists for hundreds of years, is not really accepted. People say, oh, you shouldn't be tribal or whatever. Yes, you should, because that's where your culture lies. That's my opinion. Of course, you should not use your tribalism to like divide people, but that's where your origin lies. It's not within the borders of whatever came out of colonialism. It's not the Cape Verdean border. It's not the Guinea-Bissau border versus the Guinea-Conakry border. No, there's something else in between those borders that crosses the borders, and though that thus could also unite those places, that is more important, and that has cultural value, that has cultural strength, that carries pride, that carries wisdom. Wisdom lies in culture, in my opinion. Culture is what carries the wisdom of the people, and I think we have to embrace that. We have to tell those stories, because that's what will build us, and it's happening slowly. It's really happening. It's happening also with the help of the diaspora, of African Americans also, who have access to these huge budgets to create wonderful woman kings. And I think that's the magic of it. That's the magic of it.
And I hear you. The future, we're realizing the future lies in the filmmakers knowing that they have a social responsibility to creating these heroes to begin to inspire the young ones. And just one last thing, and then I'll tell you about my research, but I have to stop recording before then. Because when you talk about filmmakers knowing their social responsibility to the society. And I'm speaking for my Nigerian filmmakers. The first question will be, how do we get the fund? So how did you come about the fund for this? And we're not asking how much now, but how did you get the funding for your documentary, and how difficult was it to have someone?
I think it's not funded by anybody outside. So I don't need a Range Rover, let me say it that way. But I need a documentary. I know it's a little bit unfair to say that, but let me just say it that way. I don't need a huge camera. Like, a good third of the scenes in that film is my iPhone.
Really?
The Africologist is about sitting there, capturing it correctly. I have a friend in Kenya that had a group of people working for him to create content, and he bought some Canon, I don't remember which ones. I always confuse those expensive camera, the numbers behind. I have my equipment too, but and the camera was worth basically a year of salary of the people that he was working on content with, that were creating content for him. And I told him, sell those cameras, give them smartphones, and pay them better. And that's how we should approach things. We don't need expensive equipment. We don't need to have in Nigeria the latest Red camera or the latest Alexa camera and then pay people low wages. Pay them better so that they can spend more time on the story, so that they can put more energy on the story, they can believe more in it, and then maybe the camera will follow later. A story is not a camera. A story is not a camera. And I try not to show it in the film because, unfortunately, if I submit it to some festivals and say, hey, I shot 2/3 of this on an iPhone, then they will say, oh, no, maybe we shouldn't take that one. Maybe let's take pass. Let's take another one. But the irony is that nobody has noticed yet that it was partially shot on iPhone. So that's exactly the thing. Nobody watches Black Panther and says, oh, was this shot on Alexa cameras or on Red? Of course, that one has very high budget, but at the end, it's the story that matters. That's what we have to consider. And if you can, I did make some sacrifices, maybe, and sacrifices have different levels, time sacrifices, financial sacrifices, and decisions where you decide, okay, now do I do this with myself or for myself, or do I invest that in the film? That's how I approached it. And try to own what you do. That's very important. Very often we think, okay, now I have this amazing idea. Let me find a producer to work on it with, to help me finance it, but then he will own it. So you better make it with a lower budget and keep the rights for it. And then you can do whatever you want with it. That's my approach to things. And that's how I think we should work with this kind of projects.
Amazing, fantastic. Oh, I said that was the last question. I lied. Now this is the last one. Distribution, and it's really important because this is a very important documentary that needs to be seen by Africans. What plan do you have that for Africans to see this documentary?
I am very careful. I am very patient, and that's part of my plan. Is really first is festivals. That was very important for me. This film is really not the film that I want to do. Like my first film was all about Cape Verde, so I kept it in that Cape Verdean circle in the United States. I had presentations in very good universities, some of the best universities about it, but it was always in that African circle and very academic. And this is also with this one. To me, this is also something that I want to present in universities, and I want to have that like scientific backup and that little push from the academic side where I can say, okay, now I can dive into something better. So distribution for this one, I'm more focused for now on having it recognized in festivals. Then I will see where, because that increases your value when it comes to distribution. The better it does before the higher it's all about negotiation at the end, no? So that's why I'm not really worried about distribution for now. I will focus on that next year. This year was for festivals, and then this is not the film that I want to do for high numbers. This is the film for recognition of the quality that I can create. And then based on this one, my plan is to work on something. I already started on it. The music is done, and I'm working on the next one. And that's for me the one that where I will be more worried about distribution. And
it's a documentary as well.
I think so. Like this one is not 100% a documentary, let's say. This one is a docu-fiction. You have all those scenes of that girl. So it goes a little bit in that direction.
Great. Thank you very much. And your docu-fiction, actually, it's actually getting the recognition you aimed for, because we know you in Nigeria, you're already getting nominations here and there. We are happy to have you at ENIFF this year, and we're really thankful that you submitted to us. We are happy to share this experience with all of the people that will be coming to ENIFF